I've entitled this series Unstoppable. And the reason I've entitled this series Unstoppable is because as we make our way through the book of Acts, we will see that nothing can get in the way of God's global expansion of his message of grace. Nothing. And the purpose of this series really is to trace God's flawless work through flawed people. You're going to encounter two things. We will encounter two things as we make our way through the book of Acts. We will encounter once again a flawless God who continues his work infallibly and flawlessly. And we will also encounter flawed and faulty people. We will encounter people that you would least expect to be used by God, to then be used by him in a mighty and a powerful way. I mean, Acts really is the story of God's grace flooding out into the world. That's what it is. In fact, nothing is more prominent in Acts than the spread of good news. It's written by Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, and is the second part, as you heard me read this morning. Acts is the second part of a two-part history. So at the beginning of Acts, addressed to the same person, Theophilus, Luke refers to the first book that he wrote. In my first book, O Theophilus, and he's referring back to his gospel, his account there. And as we make our way through Acts, because it's really the second part of a two-part history, as we make our way through Acts, we will consider Luke and Acts together at certain points as two parts of a larger whole. Now, in Luke chapter 1, verse 3, he says that his goal is to write an orderly account. Now, when we typically think of something that is an orderly account, especially as it pertains to history, we think order in terms of chronology, that things are reported according to the timeline in which they happen. But it's not orderly in a chronological sense, it's orderly in a geographical sense. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think it's important and it's beautiful. The way that Luke does this. In the Gospel of Luke, Luke traces where in the world Jesus is. In Acts, Luke traces where in the world the gospel goes. Okay, so if I could just sort of simplify it so you have a decent understanding in your mind of what he's trying to accomplish in Luke and what he's trying to accomplish in Acts. In Luke, he traces where in the world Jesus is. He kind of traces Jesus geographically. And then in Acts, Luke traces where in the world the gospel goes. It's kind of the first century version of where in the world is Carmen Sandiego, if you remember that. It's kind of what Luke is doing here. And here's a general picture of how he does this, okay? In the beginning of Luke, this is like a broad overview, all right? So this is like 7 or 8 minutes of Sunday school lesson, okay? But I think it's important, especially as we launch a new series, to have kind of a bird's eye view of what Luke's attempting to do here. In the beginning of Luke, chapters 3 through 9, Jesus is in Galilee. We see Jesus in Galilee, ministering in Galilee. And then in chapter 9, verse 51, we have that wonderful statement of purpose verse in which Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, Luke says. In that verse, that Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. And then for the next 10 chapters in the Gospel of Luke, we follow Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem before Luke ends with Jesus dying in Jerusalem. Okay, so it takes you from Galilee to Jerusalem and then specifically to a cross just outside of Jerusalem. Acts then begins with Jesus' ascension and then begins the widening out process. Okay, so try to envision Luke and Acts together as sort of an hourglass shape. Okay, if that makes sense. Luke begins wide at the top with Jesus in Galilee, and then it narrows to Jerusalem, and then it narrows further to the cross just outside Jerusalem. And that's kind of the pinch point of the hourglass, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. That's the one grain of sand we're supposed to focus on. And then from that moment on, as we begin in Acts, we see the reach of the gospel begin to kind of widen out. Okay, so now it goes from, like this, and then it starts to go like this. So in Acts 1:8, Jesus tells the disciples that they will be his witnesses in Jerusalem and in all of Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so Acts is really the unfolding of the unstoppable broadening of the gospel's reach from that cross to the whole world, carried out by God through people like you and me. Carried out by God flawlessly through flawed and faulty people like you and me. And Acts 1-8 really does tell the story of gospel proclamation in Jerusalem. And then Acts 10 shows its proclamation to the Gentiles, Judea and Samaria. And then it moves on and tells us about Paul's 3 missionary journeys, which is the ends of the earth. Okay, so what Acts really is an account of not only Jesus' ascension at the beginning, but what happens after Jesus' ascension, the fulfillment of what God said he was going to do. I'm going to take this word of grace, this good news, to Jerusalem, to Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. But listen, in a sense, Acts is not over because Paul, the Apostle Paul, never makes it to the ends of the earth, which at that time was thought to be Spain. So Acts, in a sense, is an ongoing history. The movement of the gospel is not over when Acts ends. The gospel, in other words, is still unstoppable even today. And Jesus promised that in chapter 1, verse 8 of Acts, where he says that the gospel of grace is going to spread unstoppably. It's going to accomplish its work. Now, notice he doesn't say in verse 8, would you please be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth? Will you please? I mean, gosh, I need your help with this. Okay, would you please be my witnesses? He doesn't say that. What he says is, you will be my witnesses. Now, we read right past this as if nothing significant is going on. If Jesus would have said, will you please be my witnesses? That's a very different thing than Jesus saying, you will be my witnesses. And we read right past that, but if we do, we miss a remarkable truth about God. His work is not dependent on our work. Okay, he is faithful, and we'll see this as we make our way through Acts and look at some of these characters that he uses. I mean, when he is faithful, even when we are faithless, his work through us is unstoppable. And we're going to see that God's power pushes the gospel of grace through geographical barriers, cultural barriers, ethnic barriers, language barriers, persecution, relational fallout, imprisonment, weakness, suffering. None of these things are able to stop God's work of global grace expansion. None of it. And elsewhere, Jesus promises that he is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. There is nothing above the earth or on the earth that can stand in the way of God's otherworldly commitment to spread the gospel of good news around the world. Nothing can get in the way. And that is a huge encouragement to me personally, not only because I am a flawed preacher, but because I'm a flawed person. To be totally honest with you, sometimes I get scared that my mess ups are going to get in the way of God reaching people. I mean, as a preacher in particular, I think I have to say this right. I have to explain it correctly. I have to be convincing. I have to be passionate. I have to press this in down deep. All of those things are worthy goals if you're a preacher, but the fact of the matter is, I'm not very good at any of those things, and oftentimes I will leave on Sunday morning and go, I mean, it either went over their heads or the look on their faces indicated that it just wasn't sinking in. Is their spiritual well-being dependent on me and how I say things and how I communicate things? And if so, they're in trouble. Because and so oftentimes, and it's almost like our default mode, I think to myself, if I I don't want to mess up for their sake. God's work will be hindered to the degree that I don't say it right and do it right, but I can get over that pretty quickly. But it bothers me still when it comes to my kids. You know, I mean, if you're a parent and you have kids, then you, like me, probably live under the pressure of thinking that you have to do it right, that if you mess up, it's gonna mess your kids up forever, that if your kids see you screw up, then God's work in their life will be hindered in some way, shape, or form. We feel this all the time. We feel like God's work through us is dependent on our effectiveness, our goodness, or those sorts of things. And so this is a huge encouragement to me, because Acts makes it clear that God's purposes in reaching broken and sinful people with his grace are unstoppable. They are not dependent on me. They're not dependent on you. So oftentimes we can give our greatest witness. When Jesus says, you will be my witnesses, we automatically think that means that we have to go out onto the highways and the byways with signs and preach. Okay, or we have to live such an upright and holy life that people will see just how perfect God is. Well, I can tell you just from personal experience that some of the ways God has shown himself to me to be unbelievably gracious is through your mess ups. I mean, I've never seen God's grace more than when I was growing up and I would see my parents' flaws and failures and weaknesses, and they would then acknowledge those things and say, you know, I'm sorry. It is oftentimes through our worst moments that God shows us his best. And that shouldn't surprise us, because Paul tells us later in Corinthians that God makes his strength known through our weaknesses. So the best way to be an effective witness for God and his amazing grace is to be human, not to be perfect. God's amazing grace shines through our cracks. So the pressure is off for us to be perfect, make sure all of our I's are dotted and all of our T's are crossed in order for us to be effective witnesses for God. I mean, if God was needing perfect people to be effective witnesses, he would not have used you and me or anybody that we will find in the book of Acts. Look at where, and we'll see this in a few weeks, look at where the Apostle Paul was when God found him and magnificently defeated him on the road to Damascus. I mean, you know, God could have selected anybody. Why did he choose Saul, who became Paul? Why in the world would he do that? In one sense, to shock the world. I mean, he was a zealous persecutor of Christians, thinking that he was actually doing God a favor by killing Christians and putting them in jail because he thought they were blasphemers. They were worshiping this Galilean named Jesus, who was an imposter. And the best way to keep God's honor is to get rid of these people who were following what they called in those days the way. And God levels him. Saul had developed this amazing reputation of being scary, of being a real jerk, of being a murderous persecutor. Who better for God to use to showcase that God uses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise? That God uses the weak things of the world to showcase his strength. So this idea that you will be my witnesses is not simply you need to make sure you're doing it right and not making any mistakes and saying it right if people are going to understand something of God's grace. People understand God's grace probably the best when we mess up and acknowledge it. And I've said this before, the world does not need to see our competence. What they need to hear is our confession. That we are weak like you, we are afraid like you, we are needy like you, we need help like you do. They don't need us to be flexing our muscles and to be showing them that we are just as strong as they are, just as mighty as they are, and those sorts of things, just as smart as they are. That's not important. What is important is that they hear us confessing our need. That before they see us pointing the finger at them, they hear us pointing the finger at ourselves and saying, we are the worst sinner that we know. That's what Paul said. I'm the worst guy that I know. I mean, because I know myself best. He wasn't more stricken and saddened by the sins he saw out there. He was more stricken and saddened by the sins he saw in here, and he communicated that first and foremost. And so, all of these things, I mean, this idea that God promises to use flawed people, weak people, is a huge encouragement to me. As I said, the grace of Jesus shines brightest through the cracks of imperfection. I got some horrible preaching advice when I was in seminary from a visiting pastor who was teaching a preaching class. So some of you know that Steve Brown was one of my preaching professors when I was in seminary. This advice did not come from Steve Brown, okay? In fact, Steve Brown's advice is the antithesis of what I'm about to tell you right now. But I was sitting in class, and the sad thing about it is I was a young whippersnapper, 25 years old or so, and I'm listening, and this guy was pastoring a large church, and he had the respect of all of the students in the classroom, and we felt like we were honored to be hearing this guy wax eloquent about pastoral ministry and preaching in particular. And he looked at the class one day with the utmost seriousness, and he said, "Do not open up about your struggles. Your people need you to be a model." Okay, now I'm listening to this going, yes, that's right. They need me to be a model. I have to make sure that I conceal the bad parts of me and never say anything publicly that would make them think anything less than the fact that I am somewhat of a spiritual superhero, which, by the way, and I meant to say this earlier, I apologize to the 10 or 12 congregants who are here this morning that I cut off on my way to church this morning. I saw Westminster, I was like, I'm thinking, these people, I surely hope they don't recognize my car. I need to get the tint on my windows darker. This is why I don't put anything on my car that identifies me as a Christian, because I don't drive like one. And when I'm late to church, and there's no one driving down Federal Highway going south on Federal Highway on Sunday mornings, except for the people who are coming to Coral Ridge, all right? I should know better, so I'm like, sorry, running yellow lights, sorry, honking, so I apologize for that. Just saying that, according to the guy who spoke to our class many years ago, is a terrible thing to say. They need you to be a model. They need to be able to look at you and look at your relationship with your spouse and look at your family. They need to see your kids scrupulously taking notes during the sermon. These are the kinds of things he was saying. And these are the kinds of things that I would impose, not only on myself, but on my wife and kids and that sort of thing. And the reason that's the worst preaching advice anybody could ever receive, ever, the assumption is that God works through good and strong people. That's the assumption of a statement like that. But the fact is that God only works through bad and weak people, because bad and weak people are all that there are. Okay? And that's what we not only see as we make our way through Acts, that's what we see as we begin in Genesis and end in Revelation. God is only using bad and weak people, because bad and weak people are all that there are. There was a tweet by a guy this week who should know better, a preacher, whose name I will not give you, although I'm tempted, so that you steer clear. And it's not Joel Osteen, okay? It's not Joel Osteen, my gosh. I'm starting to feel bad for the guy, you know? Everybody picks on him. I'm like, there are people in our camp who are doing just as much or more damage than Joel Osteen is. So let's focus on what our problems are. It's easy to pick on someone like that. It's easy to pick on someone like that. There are people close to home. We make fun of him because he doesn't really use the Bible and he's a motivational speaker and he's just smiling all the time. And it's just annoying, you know? I'll tell you what, he's onto something though. He's onto something because I wrote a book about suffering a couple years ago called Glorious Ruin. And what followed my writing of that book was the worst year of my life. The worst year of my life. It's terrible. Joel Osteen writes books about being happy and rich, and he's happy and rich. So I'm like, hold on a second. There may be a formula here. I'm going to start writing books about being happy and rich. See what happens. You never know, you know? But he's easy to pick on. There are people close to home who use their Bibles, who proof text from the Bible and use their Bibles, and because they're reading their Bibles wrongly and because they're smart and they use theological language, they get you to believe something about God and how God works and who God works through that simply isn't true. And here's a perfect example of one of those people. He said, I couldn't believe it. I was in the gym working out with Steve Saliba, and this popped up, and I've never lifted heavier weights in my life than I did after I read this tweet, I promise you. I was so mad as a hornet, as my southern mother used to say. That's what he said. We do not need weak preachers with a weak message speaking to weak congregations about reaching a dying world. And I'm like, who do you think you are, man? I mean, literally. We don't need weak preachers. Now, there's an assumption that a weak preacher preaches a weak message. Well, I don't know exactly what he meant by that. Speaking to weak congregations. So let's change the wording because I'm assuming this is what he means. We need strong preachers with a strong message. I'm assuming a do more, try harder, get your act together message. We need strong preachers with a strong message speaking to strong congregations. I'm like, who qualifies for that? I'd like to see the person be willing to stand up and say, I qualify for that. I qualify for that. These are the kinds of people that do not take God's law seriously at all, believe it or not. They charge those of us who preach grace and the gospel of grace week in and week out with not taking God's law seriously. We actually take it super seriously, which is why we preach it. Preach grace. Because we know how badly we need it. Well, when you dumb down God's law to the point where you actually think you can jump the hurdle, that you can make it, you just sort of lower the bar so the standards are achievable, then you say stuff like this. And you begin to have a flawed understanding of who you are, a flawed understanding of who God is and how he works. There was a Scottish minister who I have the utmost respect for. He's been dead for hundreds of years now, and wrote many, many good things, named Robert Murray McCheyne. But he said one thing that I used to love when I was a seminary student. And then you read the Bible and you live life and you fail and you suffer and you go from being an idealist to a realist and those sorts of things. And you begin to reevaluate a statement like this and go, I don't like that at all. It's preposterous. This is what he said. He was a preacher. The greatest gift I can give my church is my personal holiness. Now I have the utmost respect for McCheyne, like I said, but that is ridiculous. Let me tell you something. The greatest gift I can give you is the good news that Jesus has done for train wrecks like me what I could never do for myself. Amen. Now, the second most important gift I can give you is my desperation. Do not listen to a preacher who isn't desperate. Don't. It hasn't sunk in. They need to suffer before they preach. I feel sorry Okay, here, Jesus says, you will be my witnesses. And then he chooses broken, burned out, bad people to be his witnesses. Okay? I feel sorry for all of the people that heard my sermons the first 5 to 6 years I was a preacher. I feel sorry for them. I publicly apologize, okay, for putting on your shoulders burden after burden after burden, because I have a confession to make. My goal, if you were one of those people, my goal during that time, even though I didn't realize it, my goal during that time was pretty simple. I wanted you to do more. I wanted you to try harder. I wanted you to get better. And I wanted you to become a Calvinist. That's it, okay? That was pretty much my goal as a preacher, all right? And then you live and you suffer and you crash and you burn. And then you live a little bit more and you suffer more and you crash and you burn even more. And you go from being a young idealist to a realist. And I've said this before, that when I was 21 years old and a new Christian, 22 years old, my goal was to change the world. And now I'm 42. And I go, I can't change my wife. I can't change my kids. I can hardly change myself, much less the world. Thank God for Jesus. There's a huge difference in that approach, okay? So don't just skip past this idea that Jesus says, you will be my witnesses, and then you keep reading and you discover the kinds of witnesses that Jesus uses. I mean, these are just, these people are train wrecks. I mean, they really are. So if you think that you need to be perfect, or at the very least be really, 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 really good in order for God to use you, or you need to be smart, or you need to have it all together, or you need to have good kids in order to say something about parenting, or you need to have a good marriage in order to say something about marriage. You know the people I've learned the most from about parenting and marriage? People who have blown it as parents and spouses. They have something to say to me. They're not speaking from some ivory tower and waxing eloquent about all of the things they do right. They're talking to me from the gutter with dirt under their fingernails, going, I've blown it, and this is what I learned, that God's grace is sufficient in my weakness. I've learned that even in the terrible mishaps of my life, God has showcased his strength. So be encouraged, like I am. You're way worse than you think you are. But God's grace is going to flow into you and through you into the lives of other people, most notably through the mistakes that you make. That's what we see here as we will make our way through the book of Acts. My friend, who is also a pastor, responded to that ridiculous tweet, okay, that I mentioned a minute ago about we don't need weak preachers with a weak message, speaking to weak congregations about reaching a dying world. It's just horrible, man. Horrible. So my friend, who has crashed and burned significantly, and whose preaching has become 1,000 times better because he crashed and burned, said this in response: "We are weak men speaking to weak people a message of scandal and foolishness that destroys the wisdom of the wise." Now that's a lot better, okay? That you should pay attention to. So the fact that God moves through us unstoppably, and most notably, he moves through our weaknesses and our mess ups and that sort of thing, doesn't take away from the fact that he does in fact choose to use us. He does in fact choose to use us. So I don't want people to get the wrong idea and say, well, it's unstoppable, and that means that I don't need to do anything, or I can just sort of, lay on my couch all day. The fact of the matter is, God does graciously choose to use us in his unstoppable work. But what we'll discover as we make our way through Acts is that God chooses to use weak, faithless, fearful, flawed people. That's who he chooses to use. Those are the characteristics that God chooses to use. Sometimes, and I said this, if you were here a couple months ago when I addressed my mother at the beginning of the sermon, because she was sitting here and I was preaching through the commandment that says, honor your father and mother. I said this that morning. I said, sometimes we think that being good qualifies us to have an effective ministry. That's the assumption. But the truth is that no one is good. And our ministries become effective when we acknowledge our badness and live out of our brokenness. That's when they become effective. That's when people pay attention. And that's not just inside the church people. It's outside the church. I have lots and lots and lots of conversations with people who don't darken the door of a church. And the moment I start trying to convince them that they're wrong and I'm right, it's like white noise. The moment I start telling them my own story and talking to them about my own fears and my own the moment they hear me, feel me, and see me point the finger at me, they start to tune in. It's amazing. It's amazing what confessing your weakness will do. It's amazing. They actually pay attention because down deep, they know they're weak too. And if you portray yourself to be strong and have it all together, they think Christianity's for good people. And I'm clearly not good, so it's not for me. But when you demonstrate to them that you are weak and you are scared and you are bad and you mess up and all of those sorts of things, they relate to that. They go, boy, you're speaking my language, man. And then when you go on to say to them that that's who Christianity's for. Christianity is not for good people who are trying to get better. Christianity is good news for bad people coping with their failure to be good. That's what Christianity is. They pay attention to that. They listen to that. And we'll see this. So we'll see this over and over and over again as we trace God's work of grace through guilty people. Because, as I mentioned, Paul makes it clear in Corinthians that God showcases his strength through our weaknesses. You will be my witnesses, not just when you're doing it right, but when you're doing it wrong. It's not God's work is unstoppable through good people. God's work is unstoppable through the good things you do and the bad things you do. Your bad things can't get in the way of God's work through you. And your good things don't in some way catapult God's work further and further. God works in you and he works through you, both in the good times and the bad times, the hard times and the easy times, every time, all the time. So as we make our way through Acts, we'll see that God's good news is truly unstoppable. And we're going to see that disagreements and borders and bloodlines, none of these things can stop the spread of the gospel. And here's the best news of all, okay? This is the best news of all. If none of those things can stop God's work of grace, it can even find its way into the most difficult place of all, your heart and mine. And so forget being witnesses for a second. Just think about your own fears and frustrations regarding whether or not God will love you because you've blown it. I mean, is it possible for me to stop God's work of grace in my life? And the fact of the matter is, one of the subpoints of Acts is that if the work of God's grace is unstoppable in making its way around the world through all sorts of obstacles, insurmountable odds, then it can also make its way into your heart and my heart. It can also demonstrate that there is nothing that you and I can do that can separate us from God's love for us because of what Jesus has done, because of that one man in that one place at that one time, Jesus on the cross for us. It is finished, and we have been set free, and it is our set freeness that will demonstrate to the world that God is God and we are not. That he has come to do for us in the person of Jesus what we could never do for ourselves. And that's what we celebrate when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, When we gather around this table, we're not gathering around this table as good people who celebrate our goodness. We gather around this table as bad people who are crying out in desperation for God to showcase his glorious grace once again. And Jesus promises to commune with us by his Spirit when we come. This is just another way of the gospel getting to you. The good news of it is finished getting to you. And I've said this before, but I try to say it almost every time, that I thought growing up that this was supposed to be a time of somberness. But it's not. It's a time of celebration. I told you that I hated communion Sundays growing up because everybody seemed so sad, and it seemed like most people were faking sadness. Like they really felt pretty good about themselves, but they had to put on this persona that they felt bad about themselves so that they would appear to be worthy to come to the table. And the only reason I know that to be true is because I knew some of the people. It's not. It's a celebration. It's a time where we gather around and go, we are a company of desperate people, thanking you once again and celebrating the good news that you have come to deliver desperate people. That's what you do. That's Jesus' job description, the deliverer of desperate people. And so when we gather around this table, we're celebrating. We're celebrating our deliverer. That's who has come to save us. That's who has come to save you.